Mirë gjithë që keni ardhur, zgjeruesja e parë për ditën e dytë është Elena Madison, është një planer e urbanizmit dhe është zëvendës drejtoresha e Project for Public Space. Ata që me siguri mirën sa do doja se njëni planifikimin urban, po sërish në thonë këtë metodologjinë e re placemaking, atë me siguri kemi një për Project for Public Space. Ma shumë nga full për projektet e organizatet PPS, po edhe për punën që Elena bën edhe në placemaking and part of them. I kisha ftu që vetë nga Elena, please.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. I understand that it's a holiday, so I didn't know how many of you will make it. I'm very pleased that you're here, and we're trying to start almost on time. I understand this is called Kosovo time, so we'll keep it timely. There is another speaker after me, so I hope you enjoy the program. And it's a pleasure to be here for Pristina Architecture Week. This is not my first visit to Pristina. Last time I was here was in 2010, so it's kind of interesting to see what has changed and how it has changed, and a lot of changes on the outskirts, and the downtown seems to be more or less the same. So, I'm here to talk to you about what we call placemaking. If you are out there in the internet world, I'm sure you've probably heard the word by now. There is a reason you came tonight. So we are kind of in a very interesting situation because placemaking has become somewhat cool the last, I would say, 5 years. There was a time when Project for Public Spaces was one of the few groups that were using this language, and today it's kind of a shared meme, if you will, and because of that, there is a lot of definitions out there and a lot of things that people mean by placemaking. So I am going to tell you what we mean at Project for Public Spaces. I will tell you a little bit about the history of our organization and where our work gets its roots from and some of the basic ideas. And then I'll share a few case studies and examples of the work that we have done using those principles. One thing you should keep in mind is that the examples I'm showing you are from the United States, but we have been using this methodology internationally. We have been here in Kosovo before. We have worked with Eliza Hoxha from the architectural faculty here, and we hope to share the methodology, and I hope that you as young planners and architects will go out and do it, because that's kind of the goal of it. So this talk is not about architecture, it's really about people. So Project for Public Spaces, we are a non-profit organization, which means that we support ourselves through project work, but we also do a lot of advocacy. We have a huge website, a little too huge if that's possible. Sometimes it's hard to find things. We do training courses, we organize conferences, and in general we see ourselves as advocates for public space and for good public spaces, but we also see ourselves as advocates for public spaces that are inclusive and participatory, and public spaces that bring communities together. So on the map behind me, you see this like very dramatic map of where we've worked and trained people nationally, internationally. But the message here really is that our movement is growing, the field of placemaking is growing. We know we can't all do it by ourselves, and we want partners, and we want to share this methodology and this approach with people. And most of all, we want good public spaces, and we want to hear your stories. So a lot of the yellow dots you see on that map are really places where we've trained other people to use the methodology, and places where people have tried pilot projects that have been successful. And sometimes the project is really about the process and about working with people, even if the final result may not be quite as spectacular, or at least that's what we see in some of the international work. So if things don't work out right away, don't despair and keep doing it. Our work really came out of the thought and writings and experiences of this man, William H. White, who by training was not an architect, he was not an urbanist, he was not an urban planner, he had no connection to the design profession. He was a journalist and an economist. He wrote for Fortune magazine, and he really used social study approaches to public space and to city issues in general. And back in 1956, when everybody in America was building suburbs and moving out of the city, he wrote this groundbreaking book called The Organization Man that was actually a critique of suburban living. So he was a very forward thinker, and he was really engaged in city issues. And in the 1980s, the city planning department of the city of New York actually hired him to study some of the vacant, underused public plazas in New York. And one of the reasons that was an issue was because the city of New York at the time had a special program. It was called the Plaza Bonus Program. So developers could build bigger, much bigger buildings if they built a plaza that people can use. Of course, they built a plaza that was empty and no one was there, and they didn't care because they wanted the 2 extra floors that were bringing millions and millions of dollars. So that's how the social life of small urban spaces came about. It was really an extension of his report to the city of New York and what he found about how people use public space. And he pioneered some approaches that we use to this day. One of the things he started doing was actually filming. Now think about it, this was 1980. So film was not obvious. It's not like today when you can just film with your phone or do an app. So he was doing time-lapse filming in the 80s, and he was really closely watching what makes people comfortable in a public space, what attracts them to a public space. And he made some observations that we use as some of our basic principles of understanding what a good public space is and how people use it. So one of the things he said was, what attracts people, it would appear, is other people. And we keep forgetting that, especially in the design profession. We present our projects and our buildings and our spaces in these like pristine, empty conditions. If some of you were here yesterday, a lot of the photos we saw of wonderful architectural solutions and beautiful buildings were completely devoid of people. So that's not what we're about. We're really about bringing people to public spaces. And we also believe that the right to great, lively public spaces is a human right. It's almost up there with housing and food. A lot of times people feel like in the hierarchy of needs, public life and public spaces are really not that important, but we believe that that is actually not the case. And we've seen some really interesting dynamic examples from countries in the global south where they've understood that while not everybody can share the same comfort of living in their private home, and not everybody has as much money or access to a private car or a big apartment, everybody can share in a public realm that is fulfilling and welcoming and dynamic for everyone. So one of the things William H. White said in his very early observations that is kind of obvious was, if you want to see the place with activity, put out food. People actually go where the food is. So based on some of these observations, we've distilled some of the basic elements that we think make a great public space. One of the things that I've noticed, especially here in the region, and I don't mean just Kosovo, I've worked extensively in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe. I have family in the region, in Bulgaria to be more exact. So I understand the conditions. I'm not looking at it from an American eye, even though most of my practice has been in the United States. But one of the things I notice is that people don't think of streets and sidewalks as public space. And that is actually, in any city around the world, the largest amount of space that is usually municipally or publicly owned, and it should be treated as public space. And in many cases, we've kind of given up all of this power and all of this space to the car. And especially here in Pristina, I've seen so many sidewalks completely clustered with parked cars. And as an urbanist, I would like to encourage you to advocate for the removal of cars from the sidewalks. It's not an impossible mission. I know there is a lot of need for parking, but 15 years ago, the streets of Prague looked in a very similar way. So a wonderful city like Prague realized the value of the sidewalk as a place for people, and they found other solutions. So when there is a will, there is always a way, and there is ways to do that. So our principle is that when you focus on place, you do things a little differently. And the way we do it is by using this methodology that we call placemaking. So what is placemaking? First and foremost, placemaking is a collaborative process. So it is as much about the place as it is about the making and the doing and the working collectively of people in a community to create a public space. And I think it's very telling that I'm here tonight, Pristina Architecture Week. I'm a planner, I'm not an architect. Usually architecture issues are kind of disconnected from public space issues, or if they are connected, the connection is somewhat tenuous. But we are really in a transformative times right now because there is so much value that people are starting to see in public spaces. So we believe that placemaking can really help define communities around what is important to them and really help build public spaces around existing assets and existing qualities and things that are already in your community. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel and start everything from scratch. And really building around what you already have is the way to create something that is authentic and it's different and is special to your city, your community, your country, as opposed to necessarily bringing something over or copying something that you've seen in the United States or in Europe or somewhere else. So with that aside, my examples are going to be from the United States, but just think locally and think what is going to work for you in this context. So we feel that there's been this kind of convergence around the idea of place, and a lot of the issues that are converging around the idea of place or public space are really bigger questions, like questions of equity, questions of inclusivity, questions of art, questions of history and preservation and public health. So it's not that all of them come down to public space, but place and public spaces are connected to all of these issues. So we feel that there is a lot of overlap, and these are kind of cross-cutting issues that connect to place. The other reason we're very excited about recent developments is that this year, for the first time, public spaces and the issues of public space are going to be part of Habitat 3. It's coming up in October. It's going to be in Quito. And we've been working with US Habitat for several years now to kind of define this agenda as one of the agendas of Habitat around public space. So people are talking about it everywhere. It's not just a Western or American or European issue. It's really something that people are grappling with around the world. And we as an organization, as I mentioned already, we do organize conferences and other convenings. So this year we're organizing a big event in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. It's going to be in September. Weather in September in Vancouver, I hear, is wonderful. and it's connected to a walking biking conference, biannual walking biking conference that has been happening for 18 years now, and a future of places discussion, and something we call the Placemaking Leadership Council. So we're inviting people from around the world who are either practitioners or are interested in placemaking and have some experience to join us and kind of shape together the agenda for placemaking of the future and the agenda that we hope to bring to Habitat 3. And to end with this whole Habitat story, this is a quote from Dr. Juan Clos, who is the executive director of UN Habitat. And for the first time, UN Habitat actually recognized the importance of not just public space, but the importance of the city and the public spaces as a strategic goal for communities around the world. So we think that place and placemaking is something that can really change the way we think about building cities, the way we think about quality of life, and really mobilize people and add a real improvement to everybody's life and not just those who can afford it. So what makes a great place? We have some very basic qualities that we believe make a great public space, and of course the most important thing is what are people actually going to do in this space. So often we see public spaces that are monumental and look wonderful on a postcard or on a map or in a book, but there's actually nothing to do there, and that continues to happen, which is kind of strange, but it does. And we think that activities and uses in the public space are probably the most important component of a great public space. Comfort and image, the physical elements that actually will make people feel welcome, they will make them feel comfortable, invited, included, and so on, are also part of this picture of the great public space. But if people can't get to the park or they can't cross the street, it's kind of hard to do the public space. So access is always a big element. And then last but not least, sociability is a really important component. And sociability is really about how we include a diversity of people into the public space and make them all feel welcome and give them all a reason, or if you will, an alibi to be in the space. And sometimes we forget that. And that is the biggest problem with public spaces that have been heavily commercialized. And I saw this a lot here in Pristina, where you have some beautiful restaurant and cafe terraces, but if you're not someone who is paying for this service, you don't really have a reason or an alibi to be in the space. So with those kind of 4 basic elements in mind, we have some principles, and one of the most important ones for us is the idea that the community is the expert. Which doesn't mean, again, most of you, I imagine, are architects. It doesn't mean that we're asking people with no training from the community to come and design public spaces. The conversation is really not about design. It's about use, and it's about programming, it's about activities, and it's about the things that people know they need in their daily lives. And the reason we're not giving them those things is because we haven't really asked the right questions. So we believe that the community has to be at the beginning of the conversation from the very first days, and help define the problems, but also to help brainstorm the best solutions. We're creating a place, not just a design. Good design is an amazing tool, but like every tool, it has some limitations. So I believe that oftentimes we get bad design in public spaces because the designers have been asked to solve for the wrong problem. So when they're asked to build something that's monumental and it's going to amaze the world, that's what they do. They're not being asked to build places for people, or the way they understand how people are going to be interacting with the space may be very different. So design is one of many tools in the placemaking toolbox, so to speak. Triangulation is key. And triangulation is really an idea, and some of you are probably familiar with, but it's really an idea about layering uses and connecting small activities together to get a whole that's bigger than the sum of its parts. So on the slide behind me, you see an example, Bryant Park, New York City, fancy park, expensive, lots of money, but they've done a lot of these triangulation elements in a really, really excellent way. So in this slide, in the background, you see a carousel for little kids. In the foreground, you see a children's reading room. And in between, there's a cafe and seating for adults. So what these three elements do together is that they give a family a reason to be in this space for probably an hour, hour and a half, as opposed to if you just had a carousel by itself, which would probably be, you know, how long is the ride? 10-minute ride. Everybody else in the family has nothing else to do. The ride is over, we go home. So a lot of the triangulation opportunities are about layering uses so they support each other, the way a triangle does. And they also give an opportunity to create areas that may have less activity and may be passive, or maybe more focused on environmental issues or landscaping. So when we talk about public spaces that need people and activity, it doesn't mean that everything has to be packed with activity all the time. It really is about doing it in a way that makes sense and supports other uses and other users. And last but not least, we can't do it alone. This is not a job just for the planners or just for the designers or just for the architects or just for the municipal representatives. It really takes a lot of different people. Some of them are experts and some of them are community members and some of them are people of the arts and some of them are just residents. It takes a lot of people to make it happen, and it takes partners to keep the public spaces active, dynamic, and alive day after day. So it's not you know, you cut the ribbon and the space is there and you never have to worry about it. In fact, one of the things we say is that you're never finished. So we have this place-led, community-based process that we believe probably would give better results in many cases than a standard development process. I probably don't need to go through all of these steps with you right now, but it really centers on the idea that talking to the people in the community is kind of a key component and the starting point in this funnel that you see there, and starting with the place and the stakeholders around it and the community, and building a vision for the space together. So when I say building a vision and place vision, what I really mean is that in our work, we typically don't develop construction or design drawings. We usually work on the conceptual level. So one of the most valuable things that we do with communities is we actually produce a program for the public space that is programmatic both in terms of activities but also in terms of amenities and physical elements. And then we usually partner with landscape architects or architects, or sometimes our community partners would hire someone to take these plans and make them actually into real designs and construct and operate the space. So the roles, the way we see them from our perspective as planners and urbanists, are a little different than our role would be in a traditional design process. And we see ourselves much more as a resource and a facilitator than necessarily as an expert, even if we may have a lot of examples from around the world, but we don't necessarily have the solution for Pristina, for example. You, the people who live here, probably know a lot better what the solution is, and we just need to think together of what's the best solution. So I'm going to show you a case study of a project in downtown Houston, Texas. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Houston is a fairly big city. It's a metropolitan area of about 5 million people. So more or less the size of, I guess, Kosovo, no? a little bigger. And it has a very small downtown, and traditionally the downtown of the city of Houston has been a place for work. Large office buildings and not a lot else going on. At the end of the day, everybody gets in their car and drives back to their neighborhood or the suburbs. So in 2004, we began working with a local group to develop an idea for an urban park in the city, in downtown. So when we started, this is what the space looked like. So on the right-hand side, kind of you see a little bit of their convention center. So they have hundreds of thousands of people coming to this convention center for big conferences, and they stay inside. And what they were looking out at was a parking lot and some kind of underused green area. So when we started this visioning process, a lot of the people we were working with were like, "You're crazy, no one is gonna come to an urban park in downtown Houston. No one lives here, people get in their cars and drive away." But we believe that it can actually happen. Okay, I need to speak louder into the microphone, I guess. We believe it can happen, and we worked very actively with a whole different group of community members and a variety of stakeholders to actually understand who is the potential user of the space, how we can attract office workers, and most importantly, how we can attract families to this new park that we were trying to put together. So this was one of our very, very early diagrams. We use a concept we call the power of 10. And I can tell you a little bit more about it, and I will a little later, but it's very simple. It's about layering and connecting spaces. So if one good place has 10 little things to do, then in a park of this size, you should probably have like 10 different places with a different character. So this was our very early diagram of what that space may look like. We did some very loose drawings. We like keeping them cartoonish and very loose because they are really just a tool we use for conversation. Today, with a lot of the photoshopping and 3D visualizations, things look very final. So we're trying to keep them very kind of light and loose. We did some of these analysis. They don't look pretty, but they were very useful, basically programming documents. And these were the documents and a descriptive report. And these were the documents that went to the landscape architects. In this case, it was Hargraves Associates. It's a very large, fairly famous landscape architecture firm. And they took those ideas and kind of interpreted them in their own design language. So you can see how the things that we were showing as very kind of soft and bubbly and round and organic became very geometric and straight lines, because that was Hargrave's basically vocabulary. And it took about 2.5 years, and they built it. And here it is. It's an aerial view. And you can already see in that upper corner how a new building has started construction. So the effect of this public space was enormous. Not just because people started coming downtown and using the space, but in terms of all the development that it spurred around it. So one of the elements that we paid a lot of attention to was in that original shot of the parking lot that I was showing you, there was actually an alley of live oaks. They're very valuable, rare trees, and everybody wanted to preserve them. So this is the oak alley. And one of the conversations we had in the public workshops was, because people were so attached to the trees, there wasn't that much else there. Someone started talking about a tree house. So the interpretation of the tree house was actually a restaurant with a terrace that kind of overlooks and is in the trees. But it was interesting to see how the architects actually kind of connected to the idea of the tree house, even if it doesn't necessarily look like a tree house. But for the people who gave that idea, it was very important to see it back and see it real. We added the park has a number of elements. It has a terrace and a lake, and we kind of borrowed and modeled after some of the best parks in the world. So they have model boats like they do in the Luxembourg Gardens, and they do kayaking events in the lake. They have a lot of events that are under this covered area because it's Houston and it gets really, really hot. And one of the great things that, again, came out as an idea from the public workshops was the idea of having a library in the park. So it's not a big library, they're calling it a library express, and all you can do there is drop off books that you've taken, borrowed in another branch, and they host events. And they do readings in the park and a lot of activities for kids. So it's much more of a meeting room and an outdoor meeting space than a library, but people think of it as the library. Of course, in the winter they do ice skating, but it's Houston, so it's 25 degrees in the winter. Some people are skating, other people are still in the water fountain. They have dog runs. I know Americans are very obsessed with like special facilities for dogs. So there is a dog run, there is a really interesting playground that's attracting people from around the city who drive there just to play in the playground. They have a stage. They created a market. So that was an interesting element. We were always a little hesitant about the market. We weren't sure how that's going to work. So they started with a farmer's market on weekdays at lunchtime, and what they discovered was they added music, there was prepared food, there was bread and cookies, and what they discovered is most of the office workers didn't want to go during their lunch break to buy tomatoes or lettuce. So we went back with them and we did some more visioning and studying of the market, and we retooled their market from a farmer's market into a night market, and it's makers and arts and crafts and other services, like the man in the photo with the bicycle actually does free bicycle repair. It's a night market, it happens once a month, and it's a huge success. So that is usually the sign that you kind of have the right recipe. They added some interesting site-specific art elements, so the art that you see in this photo was designed specifically for the park. But what was more exciting to me was to see families that bring their own props, the Christmas decorations, and these people were taking the Christmas photos in the park. So they bring their own props, they feel like it's their park, and they can do anything in it. And the other element that was really the managers of the park that developed these ideas were the ideas of nighttime programming, because it's usually pretty hot in Houston, especially in the summer, and programming focused around arts. Houston has a large artistic community and a lot of interest in arts, so they started doing things like this, starting with things that were local, moving on to international artists. This is a very famous artist that does these LED installations using art and performance and light in the lake, and a whole other host of programs around the existing facilities. So one of the things that they realized was that if you have something really interesting and exciting, people will actually go home, change, drop off whatever they're doing after work, and come back to the park if the programming is taking place at the right time. So most of the office workers are done with work by 5:30. They start yoga in the park at 6:30, so people can drive home, get their yoga clothes, come back, find free parking downtown, because parking downtown after 6 o'clock is free, and join the yoga class. So a lot of these things had to be tweaked through the life of the park to make sure that it works. But I think the most interesting part of that story is that this park has become a tremendous generator and catalyst for development of all around it in downtown. So in the diagrams, the buildings you see in red are brand new buildings that didn't exist when we built the park. So the city of Houston is now seeing the value of a public space that can actually bring lots of people back downtown, but also millions of dollars in investment and development. So this is a project that we kind of followed through from conceptual and programming and ideas, ideation level, through the design and into implementation, and we keep coming back and kind of tweaking it with the partners who are running the park right now. Very quickly, I am going to show you something that we did in Harvard University, and that is something that we call lighter, quicker, cheaper. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's cheap, especially in Harvard, but it was meant to be a light intervention that doesn't necessarily involve a huge amount of capital and construction, and it was really about activating a few very specific places on campus. And one of these spaces was a place that the campus was seeing as kind of the gateway of the community on campus. It's right here. And as you can, I don't know if you can see it, it's marked in white. It's right outside of the Science Center, and it's basically a plaza that was built on top of the highway. So it was a capped highway. It wasn't very well used. Here's the concept. So they were reconstructing and repairing this overpass, and the idea came about to turn it into a public plaza that is actually active, but also turn it into a place that's welcoming the community that lives around Harvard but are not part of the university. So a place that is very accessible and approachable, and it doesn't feel like, oh, this is Harvard and I can't be there. And we worked with a whole bunch of different university departments. At the end of the day, the university actually created their Common Spaces department that is going to be dealing with all of these amenities and issues, and this was one of our very early conceptual plans. I don't know if you can necessarily read the labels, you don't need to worry about them, but we were applying these same principles of like understanding the existing uses, looking at potential users, looking at what they may need, and most importantly, layering these activities in a way that makes sense. So you already saw this photo, but this is the Common Spaces Plaza on opening day. And it's very simple. Essentially, there is food, there is places to sit, there's some other activities, and I'm going to show you a little bit more about them. And it connects into one of the main courtyards in Harvard. And it was kind of an uphill battle. It was very interesting because it was one of the very famous Harvard greens that have always been pristine and empty. People just use the space to walk through, but never stop there. So the idea that we're going to put like tables and chairs and games in the space was a little difficult. But once they tried it, they realized it's actually working. So these are some lawn games that we put there. This was an idea that actually came out of the students who were talking about how stressed out they are by being, you know, at Harvard, and there's so much pressure. So they were talking about a petting zoo. So one of the student groups actually organized the petting zoo. We added some of these lighter elements and, you know, amenities to make this lawn a little bit more usable, but nothing really too dramatic. The dramatic change was the repair of the overpass and the adding of a series of amenities. And you see those very structural, beautiful benches. Well, they have a little story, and the story of the benches was that it was one of the departments at Harvard that commissioned them. They are fabricated especially for Harvard, and they look great, they're beautiful, but they're not so comfortable to sit on. So what we realized is we're stuck with these $20,000 a piece benches that you can't sit on, and that's why we brought the bean bags. And we actually brought the bean bags kind of separately, and then the students started putting them on top of the benches to sit on them. So one of those little lessons of like, oh, beautiful bench, but not so good for seating. We added some of these picnic tables. There is a giant chess. There is actually a chess program, and they bring kids from the neighborhood to teach them. So it became really a place from being this empty plaza that you just ran across to get to class. The interesting part is like we did a summer program, everything seemed to be working great. We needed a few tweaks like bean bags on top of the structural benches. And then we started to talk about winter because it's Harvard and it gets cold. And one of the amenities that through working with the students and the faculty came about was the idea of curling. I don't know if you guys have heard of curling. This is actually plastic, so it's not real curling. There is no brooms because you need real ice for that, but they had a whole setup for curling. We added fire pits. We added some other amenities. The fire pits were a big issue. I may have mentioned that in some of my talks earlier that in America people are very afraid of fire in public space and everything's going to catch on fire and people are going to hurt themselves. And it's like, these are smart Harvard kids. I don't think they're going to, set themselves on fire while roasting s'mores, but we had to like struggle with the fire department to get approval to use these fire pits. And it ended up being a very, very successful program. And now their own department is developing programs for some of the other areas. So it's lighter and it's relatively quick, but because of Harvard, it's not that cheap. And a lot of the amenities that you saw in the photo are very high-end and very expensive. And you could do that with a lot less money and maybe less fancy amenities. So last but not least, I'm going to tell you a little bit about this concept we use. We call it the power of 10 to scale the idea of one great place onto the level of a neighborhood with 10 great places and a city with 10 great neighborhoods or a region with 10 great neighborhoods. So whether you define a place as a park or your place is your corner bookstore and the bench outside of it, it's all kind of a matter of scale, but all of this could scale onto the level of an entire destination, an entire park, or the level of an entire neighborhood, and having layers of these other spaces. So we did this in Detroit. I'm sure you've heard of the city. It's been kind of in trouble for a while. It's a declining industrial space, and it's gone through a lot of ups and downs, and there's been a lot of strife in the city of Detroit. So we have a history of working there. We've worked on a number of different projects in the city of Detroit. We've worked with their farmers market. We've worked with some of their existing parks, and one of the spaces we worked with, not starting in, I think this photo is dating from 1932, not from 1932, but in the year 2000, we were contacted by the Downtown Detroit Partnership. It's the organization that kind of takes care of downtown, and the city was getting ready to celebrate their 300th anniversary, 300 years of Detroit. To many of you that may not sound like a big deal, but in the United States, 300 years is actually a pretty long time for a city, and they wanted to create a new public space downtown to celebrate that. And the reason I'm showing you this old photo is when we started in the year 2000, that same space looked like this. Everything was gone but the monument. Most of the buildings were gone. The public space was gone, the sidewalks, it became this intersection for cars, and the challenge was, what do we do with this? Do we just make a nicer monument and that's how they celebrate their 300th anniversary? Do we do something else? So we went through a very extensive community process with a lot of input, and because not many people live in downtown Detroit and not that many actually worked downtown at the time, we had to reach very broadly into the city and talk to them about downtown. And they're like, what, downtown? I haven't been there in years. So it was a very interesting process of collecting stakeholders and actually building a vision for them, with them, for this new public space. So this is one of those like bubble little drawings that we put together. But the big deal was that they wanted to turn an intersection into an actual plaza. So forward about 4 years, And here's the space. So it took them about 4 years to design and build. And it opened in November. Again, Detroit, winter city, November in Detroit can be very, very cold. So they started with the Christmas tree and the ice skating rink. And just like Houston, they shopped around a little bit for like the best ideas and what's working. So they were very proud that their ice skating rink is actually larger than the one at Rockefeller Center, which is a famous one, but it's actually not very big. Their Christmas tree is on top of actually their fountain. So again, they were trying to, because the space is actually not that large, they were trying to use elements in a way that could be more flexible. And the moral of the story with the winter opening is that on that winter, they had about 50,000 people come downtown just to see this. And it was all upward from there. So here's the park. It had a lot of interesting elements, water fountains that we kind of struggled with the design, the landscape architects, because we believe that it's unfair to put water in front of people and not let them touch it. But this water, as you can see from the photo, you can't really touch. But it was a very fancy fountain, and it has lights, and it can sing and dance and make coffee in the morning. And it's a very kind of elaborate amenity, and they spent quite a bit of money on it, but they felt it was worth it. And most importantly, they could actually place other things on top of the fountain, like the Christmas tree, like art and elements and other things. They spent a lot of energy and they put a lot of attention into the landscaping. And one of the reasons they did that is because they wanted to attract people who had fled the city and who had fled downtown to be in kind of pristine suburban areas. So landscaping really meant to people, this is safe, we do the same kind of fancy planting that you do in your backyard, it's safe, it's clean, come on in. One of the elements that we brainstormed together with them, because the space was so small and they needed it to be flexible, they actually installed a hydraulic stage. So the area that you see here is flat and it's used for all kinds of activities, but when they have a big event, it's a stage that comes up and it's very, very flexible. And of course they have places to sit and landscaping and other elements. So in 2012, okay, I don't need to yell into the microphone anymore. In 2012 we went back to Detroit. And one of the things that was happening at the time was that the city was actually on the brink of bankruptcy. And there was a real desire from a lot of people to kind of do something different and give people hope. So there was a big winter celebration, again, fire pits. Not that, I'm not obsessed with fire, but it's a very good way of pushing the envelope in places where people are very much concerned about that. But it's not really about the fire, it's about a very extensive process that we engaged with people in Detroit around this park, again, to actually see what we can improve and how we can use the success of this one space to spread it and scale it up to ideally all of downtown. So after many, many meetings, we built this like big vision for downtown. We worked with a lot of the office buildings. So in 2010, a big mortgage company called Quicken Loans moved their headquarters from the suburbs of Detroit to downtown Detroit. The president, the CEO of the company was born and raised in Detroit, so he wanted to come back. So all of a sudden, around this park, there were a lot more office workers, a younger generation, millennials, people who wanted to be hip and do other things. So a lot of the visioning was about what we can do for those people, but also what we can do to bring everybody else from the city. So one of the spaces we looked at that's connected to our park was this other kind of vacant square called Cadillac Square, and we had a lot of discussions about food and markets and so on. So this is a visualization as well. It's not an existing condition. We filled in some of the vacant lots with buildings. We put in the tram because we knew they're discussing that, and they're actually in the process of constructing this tram line that you see in the photo. But we basically came up with this strategy for expanding the reach of the park and its influence in downtown, and just an overall placemaking strategy for downtown Detroit. And one of the big ideas there was to do a lot of these lighter, quicker, cheaper interventions in a really short period of time. So we were thinking of a few months up to a couple of years. So not long term, but really quickly, and really anchor activity in the spaces that are already working and kind of grow the network from there. We did a lot of crowdsourcing and 1 million workshops and pop-up workshops and a lot of happy hour. People love happy hour. So it was a lot of socializing and really getting people to talk about what was working in the park, but also what else they wanted to see. And the big thing was that everybody wanted to see more life on the streets. So that was kind of the push of the plan. And the idea was also that the city actually already had quite a few active destinations, but everything was very internalized. There was a great museum, there was a library, there was a bunch of different buildings, businesses, there was a lot of entrepreneurship and incubators, but everything was indoors, partially because they have a lot of vacant space, so it's easy to get an indoor space. So one of our strategies was, how do we bring this exciting activity from the inside out and make it visible? So this is our little plan of Campus Marshes 2.0 and Cadillac Square with our Power of 10 idea. So we got up to 12, but I think sometimes we cheat a little bit. So you understand that the number 10 is just a metaphor, but we wanted to get these micro places and actually think about how they function. So one of these micro places was the southern lawn of the park. The one with the monument, it's right here. The woman you see getting married on this photo actually ended up managing the programs in the park, so she's very connected to the park. But it wasn't a very well-used area of the park, and people felt like the monument was kind of isolated, it was cutting circulation and pedestrian traffic. So we wanted to do something with it. And a lot of the conversations with people in the community were about all of the assets, not just of the city of Detroit, but of Michigan. And people kept talking about Michigan beaches. You may not think of Michigan as a place of beaches, but they have lakes and beautiful lake beaches. So a lot of conversations revolved around the beach. So we ended up building a beach with no water. So here it is, we're building it, it's in the process of being constructed, completed. So it's essentially a sandbox and a deck. And then we added a lot of other things to it. Tables, chairs, a beach bar, which was very important. You know, beach chairs. People started coming out, and the most interesting thing that we were hoping for, but we didn't know if it's going to work, was that families started coming out. And the thing to remember is that there is very few families with children that live downtown. So most of the people you see in these photos actually drove from the suburbs to downtown, parked, went to you know, the bar, the beach, so the kids can play. So it became a family destination, and we weren't necessarily hoping that's going to happen. And as you can see from the photos also, it's a very mixed crowd. It's not just white office workers, it's a variety of people. We added, after the fact, once we realized there's so many kids, we added some of these simpler games and amenities that could serve kids that are a little bit older, but also the office crowd during happy hour can use. And we developed our food market that I was showing you in the vision plan before. So this was opening of the food market. those little kiosks that you see were used for their Christmas market, so they were kind of repurposing them and trying to see if it really would work as a concept. One of the things that was happening was that the surrounding office buildings actually have cafeterias in them, so people usually don't go out for lunch. And we negotiated with the cafeteria operators to close the cafeterias on opening day of the food market, so everybody would have to go and actually try the food. All the vendors in those little kiosks actually have restaurants that are not downtown, so they're kind of showing off their business. We added music and so on, and all of a sudden it became a place, and they continued doing it. So they, in one of the vacant lots, they did basketball. They started adding, as you see, outdoor furniture to these very kind of stark modernist buildings, and really expanding the influence of these very dynamic public spaces throughout downtown, through some amenities, through fun things like, you know, the dueling pianos. And the guy on this orange side is actually the owner of Quicken Loans, so it's kind of a big deal. So that was our applying Power of 10 to a number of spaces in downtown Detroit. And what was interesting about that beach example that you saw, the beach opened on the day that the city declared bankruptcy. So most of the money to build that stuff was either corporate or private, foundations, crowdsourcing. It had not really used city money, and it was a big boost to people because it was such a hard hit to know that the city has declared bankruptcy. So our strategy was really to layer these 10 by 10 by 10 small places and put people and program and activities first, as opposed to great design. And they're designing and finalizing some of these things, so they are building the light rail, and I think it's a very, very successful story. And they keep doing the beach every year. They put it away at the end of the summer, and then they bring it back. So with that, I'm going to end. I know I've been speaking for about an hour now, and I encourage you to check out our website, come to Vancouver if you want, sign up for the Placemaking Leadership Council, join the movement. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Yeah, I was just want to ask. Is er geen buurt hier? No.
Okay.
You get past in the house or
A picture's worth 1,000 words, I guess. Thank you.